I'm excited to introduce some of the great speakers we have. And I'll start by introducing our first speaker, which is today's keynote speaker, Dr. Mark Brunson. Dr. Brunson is a professor of environment and society in Utah State University's Coyne College of Natural Resources. His research and teaching focuses on the dynamics of coupled human-natural systems, especially in deserts and rangelands. His current studies include cross-boundary collaboration among land management jurisdictions, institutional and ecological factors on efforts to improve sagebrush ecosystems, and water conservation implications of trends in urban tree species choices. So without further ado, let's welcome our first keynote speaker, Dr. Mark Brunson.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Ryan, and thank you all for being here early on a Tuesday morning. So my job is to begin and sort of kick off the session and sort of kick off the theme today. And so the question was, is multiple use and sustained yield of resources on public lands still possible? And as I was thinking about how to address that question, I thought back to the days about, 120 years ago now, when President Grover Cleveland set aside the first forest reserves. And the idea was that these forest reserves were going to be able to provide sustainable flows or sustained flows of timber and of water. And so then they sent out a group of people. Now that we've done this, we've reserved these lands, let's go look at them. And so they sent out a group of people. Gifford Pinchot was one of them. I believe Theodore Roosevelt was along for part of it. It was quite a grand junket right before the turn of the 20th century. And they would have come upon a landscape like this. This is a place called Whitetail Basin. It's in southwest Montana. It's a place where I did some research a number of years ago. And if they were to come across a landscape like this, this is perfect. We've got trees. Eventually they'll be harvestable. We've got nice high mountains that will store snow, that will produce water. And we've got this little added bonus. It's, once you get down below the mountains, we've got nice grass that we can graze livestock in. And we will have achieved multiple use. We will be able to do several different things here. Well, it turns out that this landscape nowadays is a heck of a lot more complicated than that. Yes, they produce water. Yes, they produce trees, timber. But these trees right in front of me, they would not have been there in 1898 or 1899. They're there because we introduced a perturbation. We introduced the control of fire. As a result, one of the reasons why I was doing research down there was trying to figure out how to address the fact that with these additional Douglas firs, the water flows were actually declining, so that the streams in Whitetail Basin were now drying up in the middle of the summer. So we have, multiple use that they imagined is no longer feasible because we were trying to protect the multiple uses that they were designed, to reserve. Those kinds of complications of the world that you live in. And so that's where we come to our question for today, which is it still possible to have multiple use and sustained yield? And I'm going to begin with the end, just tell you where I'm going. My first answer, was it ever possible? Probably not. If we talk about both multiple use and sustained yield. Multiple use is not only possible, it's inevitable. We can't get away from it. There's going to be, as long as these are public lands, they're going to be used for multiple purposes. And even when they're not public lands, they typically are. Truly sustained yield of resources, as envisioned by foresters, and I have a doctorate in forestry, so I was trained to believe you could just set up a forest, so you could harvest 1/80th of it every year, and we would have forest in perpetuity. But that's an ecological impossibility because of all the things that happen in ecosystems. Because of the perturbations, because of things that happen, disturbances, and other acts that acts of God or acts of Congress or whatever it is, But sustained flows of ecosystem services is possible if we acknowledge that the mix of services is going to shift over time. And it's going to shift over time because of constant things that are going on in the social system, the political system, and in the ecosystem. And as long as we have come up with a way to probably balance all those things and figure out how to work through that, then I think that we can get to a 21st century of multiple use and sustained yield. But it's going to require a different kind of land management. It's going to take a resilient form that tries to balance in various services. And so that's what I'd like to try and argue today as we start this conference. So this does not the West. It may not look familiar. This is New Zealand. And I introduced this because when I was a doctoral student in forestry at Oregon State University, where Douglas fir is God's perfect organism, and we learn how to sustain yields of timber, we were in the midst of the spotted owl controversy. And so a lot of people, both in the forest industry and in forest science, were frustrated by all the lawsuits and the public outcry and various things going on. And so they had a solution. They were looking to what they were talking about doing in New Zealand, or were just in the process of doing in New Zealand, which was to create an alternative to multiple use. What they did, essentially, is they took the forests that could produce timber and they privatized them. This is mostly Pinus radiata, which I learned online the other day is the prince of pines. And so if you have these indigenous forests like this, those remain in public hands. These were privatized. And this was going to be the solution. And people were saying, well, why can't we do that with forests in the United States? Well, here, let's look. So I looked into what's happened now in New Zealand, almost 30 years later. Well, in 1990, they privatized the timberlands. They managed the indigenous forests primarily for non-timber trees. Today, people are concerned. There's responsibility for forests are spread across several departments, and so no one is really in charge of forestry. And so, and the officials of all of those agencies don't know anything about forestry because it's partly in agriculture, it's partly in recreation, it's partly in something water. None of those people really understand forestry. This thing is fascinating. What's happened once you privatize it is they separated the ownership of the land from the ownership of the trees, which creates all kinds of interesting issues, kind of like we have with the severing of mineral rights or oil and gas leasing rights from the land, people who own the land. And then increasingly there's foreign investment in those timberlands, and that's causing people to be concerned. So now here we are in 2018, and New Zealand is developing or has just developed a national forest policy for the first time that's supposed to recognize, protect, and enhance the benefits of trees and forests. And they're thinking about how all these fit together. So essentially they've come to ecosystem management almost 30 years after we came to ecosystem management because of trying to get away from multiple use isn't working. All right. So how do we get a multiple use policy? And Martin Nye is going to talk about this more later in the day, and so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but multiple use is central to the missions of most agencies. So we think about it, I'm in the Forest Service and the BLM. So in 1960, Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act was passed. And what's really interesting about this law, one of the things, is that it's one of the last laws governing the public management of public lands that was actually basically designed by the agency and requested by the agency. Forest Service was already managing for multiple use. They were already managing for timber and for wildlife and fish, and they were managing for water and for livestock grazing and outdoor recreation. And so they wanted this to be codified so that they wouldn't be challenged later on the things that they could do. A few years later, BLM came into the fold. They were already managing for multiple resources, although focusing more perhaps on grazing and mining than some other things. So the Federal Land Policy and Management Act essentially, did the same thing. And it's implied in legislation for other state and federal agencies. The Park Service, you don't think of that a multiple use agency, but right in the Organic Act for the Park Service, it says we will manage for protecting the scenery and the natural objects therein, and you will also be doing this for outdoor recreation and enjoyment of future generations. And this is the way that the Fish and Wildlife Service has legislation talking about how they balance management for wildlife, for fish purposes, and management for recreation. The Bureau of Reclamation, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, all these agencies that manage natural resources have some sort of multiple use mandate, and so do the state agencies. And so, great, multiple use is there, it's always been there. I'm going to argue it's always going to be there. What about sustained yield? Well, I think the thing that really made people wonder whether this was going to work was, who recognized, where is this? Washington, yeah, that's Mount St. Helens. 1979, 1980, 81. What happened? The top of the mountain blew off. So this landscape was Weyerhaeuser timber. It was being managed on a sustained yield basis. And the timber's not there now. It caused quite a perturbation in the way that Weyerhaeuser managed that particular forest area, and probably still does today. But it's still providing some ecosystem services. The first thing I saw, years ago, I went over to the dark side, or actually the bright side. I moved from forestry to range. So the first thing I saw when I saw this picture, look at those forbs. It's still providing ecosystem services, even though it's obviously been altered. But this is the way, when I was being trained, this was sort of our idea. We have this successional process over time. We start with bare ground, we start with some, a fire or something else, meteor attack, whatever happened that created the end of this bare ground. Then we move through, sort of a meadow rangeland type setting, and of course, we happily transcend that, and we move into forest, and eventually we get to a climax community, this mature forest, and until something bad happens, until we either want to cut it down or until something bad happens, like a fire or something else that we considered bad, to start the process again. But ultimately, if we could keep it in mature forest, we're happy. But that's not how we see the world now. This is the way we describe it. You can't even figure out what this means, right? This happens to be a state and transition model developed in southern New Mexico for areas that have moved from black grama grassland to mesquite woodlands. And how does this happen? There's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different states here. I think almost everybody has had experience with a state and transition model. But in case you haven't, the basic idea here is the standard, now classic sort of ball and cup model idea that, normally, you've got a space that things. I'm going to do a little bit of interpretive dance here. The first time I ever gave a talk where I was talking about this, and the projector blew up at the moment that I was right about to start this. And so while they were running to get another projector, they asked me to keep talking so we could stay online. And so I'm trying to describe the ball and cup model. And so basically, we'll assume here that, right now, there's a sort of some natural state that we might think of as a climax, but what happens is there's various disturbances of various sizes, and so things move a little bit, or move a little more. And if they move too far, we end up in a different state. And it may be difficult or impossible to get back up to the previous state. We could think of ecosystems sort of like a spinning top where, there are all kinds of things that slow the spinning of the top. It's entropy, it's, a law of physics. Eventually the top is going to stop spinning, and we have been assuming in our management up until the development of these, these kinds of ecosystem models that that's all we need to do. We just keep the top spinning, but it won't. And so we begin to think about how do we extend the resilience of these systems so that they are better able to withstand these perturbations. If anything, what we're trying to do is make the space between states and between transitions wider so that things can stay there longer. All right. So we need to maintain resilience. So what are the processes likely to influence the complex systems in our region that we need to be resilient to? Well, do one at a time. Climate change. And I threw in variability for those who aren't convinced that the climate is changing. No, essentially, climate change, climate variability. There has been variability over millennia, and systems have, some ways, developed some processes that'll help them be resilient to that. But the way climate is changing now, we're not going to get there. Why? Well, because of things like increasing frequency of large wildfires. Everything that I read, it's like all the evidence that I can look at says, yeah, we're having more of them. They're bigger. They're starting earlier. They're coming at, in California, you can have a fire now any time of the year. You can have a large wildfire. These are this is going to affect things here. Mixing of native and non-native species in ways that we're trying to deal with. I work a lot on trying to figure out how to build resilience in the face of cheatgrass. But that's not all. We've got all kinds of restructuring of markets, job markets, financial markets. The timber crisis that we were trying to address in the late 80s and early 90s in Oregon was not only because of, these supposed, radical environmentalists who didn't know that toilet paper came from trees or whatever, or their homes came from trees. It was also because of mechanization and computerization of sawmills that made it so we didn't need as many people. And so that changes, and when you have fewer people working in the timber industry, they have less political power, which changes the balance of who wants what to happen on the public lands. All these things. Urban to rural migration. That picture I showed you of Whitetail Basin at the beginning, it's actually still back there behind every slide. If you go this direction, south, about 3 miles, you start to get to the ranchettes. It's a bunch of nice 10-acre parcels there. If there was a university there, I would happy to live there. But those people change the way you can manage those land. Political polarization. I could do another one of those sort of things. Imagine this is we're in a. Remember when we were kids and we used a swing set and you want to keep going further and further, and you want to get think of this. So now let's think about this as being if we go we're going higher. This is moving to the left. We're going to go this way, and we want people, and society keeps wanting to get more extreme on the left or the right, and we're getting this pendulum going. Well, what happens when you keep going farther and farther on your swing set, right? 2 things. Either you fall off and crack your head open, or if you were a wimp like me, you started cutting back, you're slowing down. Whoops, I'm going too far here. Well, right now, we don't know in our society whether we're going to fall off and crack our head open as the pendulum keeps swinging, or if we're going to ratchet it back and be safe and still have fun. All right. Is sustainability about sustained yield, or is it about flows of ecosystem services? I'm going to argue that it's not only about the yield of resources, it's about all kinds of things environments that the ecosystems provide for us. And the flows of ecosystem are going to be moderated by those natural and those anthropogenic perturbations. And so this is what we have to negotiate. It means changing what sustainability is defined as. I found this quote a few years ago, and I really like it. And then I was actually surprised to find an actual photo online of someone trying to nail Jell-O to a tree. It's like, wow, this is perfect. I got to use this. But sustainability is something that it's a word that's thrown about all the time, and it can mean almost anything. So this is a little bit the Google Sustainability Project. And what this was just me. I decided a number of years ago, and I just tried it again yesterday afternoon, so this is an updated list for those of you who saw it yesterday in a different talk. What happens if I type sustainable and then I type a single letter of the alphabet? Well, these are all the things that people are trying to pretend is sustainable. Agriculture, okay, great. Development, forestry, wonderful. Tourism, yes, great. Office furniture, kitchens, Ziploc bags. I have no idea what a sustainable Ziploc bag. I didn't have time to click on the link, but I'm going to. Sustainable Q-tips. Last time I did it, it was sustainable quinoa. So apparently, all right. Anyway, so sustainability is. But what I'm going to argue is that we can call sustainability whatever we want too, if everybody else is using it. And I'm going to say that sustainability is this: management for resilience, a social ecological systems perspective. As Ryan said, I'm a social ecological systems scientist. That's a really large mouthful. It means that I think about everything and that it's so complicated that I don't actually accomplish anything. But, all right. What I'm going to suggest is that resilient natural resource institutions, and an institution in this case includes the agencies that most of you work for and the academic structure that I work for, research entities. All of these are natural resource institutions. We need to be flexible. We need to get away from uniformity and rigidity. We need to be able to account for local conditions, both social and ecological. We need to promote adaptive management, where we're looking to see what happens and then responding to changes, but also having already planned for the kinds of changes we might be able to do. Doing that planning collaboratively with stakeholders as well as land managers. Because those participatory approaches make knowledge sharing more possible, and because often solutions, when they emerge, it may be messier, but when the solutions ultimately emerge, when they come from more voices, they often have, they're basically better because they've had input from people with a bunch of different experiences of the environment that we're talking about. So I finished typing this slide the other day, and I looked at it and I said, my gosh, that is such a SES is what we call it, social ecological systems. That is such an SES melange of big long words that don't mean anything. And so I don't want you to think I'm doing just buzzword bingo. I'm not sure if many of you can read that. I always hate it when people would read comics. But this idea that, people come up with all these words, and then they say, we need to change. We need to embrace change. And in this case, we've got people saying, well, is change something we should do, or will it pass quickly, or will it linger like the stench of a dead woodchuck under a porch? I don't want what I'm going to say to stand like a dead woodchuck, stink like a dead woodchuck. And so I decided, well, the only way I can do that is to give you examples of why I think this can work. So, first of all, I'm a big believer of ecosystem services. I realize that for the most part, it sounds really fuzzy because you can't measure them. How do we measure flows of enjoyment? Are there little units we'll call enjoyals? How do we measure flows of pollination? Do we have the capacity to know whether we're doing soil formation? And the answer is probably not, but we do have the capacity to know that these things are happening. We have the capacity to remember that those things need to be protected when we're designing our management strategies. And so this is the traditional, a lot of you have seen slides like this. There's sort of 4 categories that we talk about. The things that were envisioned by the people, Grover Cleveland and by Gifford Pinchot and people like that, were all provisioning services, products from nature, water, timber, forage. But then fairly soon, we started to figure out we needed to add some cultural services, things like recreation, which very quickly, by the middle of the 20th century, we were managing for recreation. The first course, this is a brag point here, the first university course on outdoor recreation management for public lands and natural resources was taught at Utah State University on what is now my department in the late 1920s. So we're making progress here. But then we have things like regulating services, like wetlands being, providing cleaning for things. We've got supporting services like soil formation, nutrient cycle, and pollination. And so, we put all those things back, and if you say, well, if you want to do collaborative management, and you want to engage stakeholders, and the first thing you need to be able to show me is that people will actually manage for those kinds of services. And the stakeholders actually care about services other than their own, and it may not seem like they do. So I was interested in this question, and so we recognized that the choices of grazing permittees influence their capacity, the capacity of us as land managers to provide multiple ecosystem services from federal land. So do livestock grazers care about this? So with my student Betsy York and with a colleague Kristen Holvey, we did a study where we surveyed, we tried to figure out what factors influence public land ranchers' choices about ecosystem services provision, and which services do they consider most important, and which ones do they factor into their management. All right, so we conducted interviews in sort of this region, Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah. Then we sent some mail surveys to 1,000 grazing permittees across the Great Basin, randomly selected. We got 435 surveys back. So what happened? Well, the first thing, when we did our interviews, we found that there were 3 main themes. Like, why do you make the choices you do? Well, one was, commodity livestock production. That's not going to surprise anybody. That's the most important thing for me is to produce food for me and for my livestock. Honoring the heritage and leaving a legacy was really important to ranchers. And control of their own destiny. A lot of the things that they did, they said, I do these things, in some cases in compromise, in order so that I might be better able to make sure that my future generations will be able to use this same land. And so I'm in charge of making my decisions, and they're not being dictated from above. So what services did they, and we asked them what services do they provide for? This is still in the interviews. So there were 19 different things that came up in these questionnaires. They're managing for weed-free environment. They're managing for upland game. They're managing for fish, healthy riparian areas. The regulating services were mentioned by these folks, pollination and wildland fuel reduction, water quality. There were course provisioning services, forage, but also things like oil and gas production, game animals, flows of water. And then there were a number of cultural services, maintaining a family legacy, demonstrating stewardship to others. These are things that drive their decisions, retaining solitude in their landscapes. And so we asked them then, this is the busiest slide I've got. It's the most complicated one. We asked them how often, we measured how often in the survey, how many people actually say they consider these things in their management. And then they're ranked here in order. So, forage was number 1, not surprisingly. It was 98.9% of public land ranchers said they managed to produce forage for livestock. I really have no idea what the other 1.1% think they're doing. But okay. But number 2 is demonstrating stewardship to society. Maintaining a legacy was number 3 of the things they think about. Moving all the way down here. So we tried to classify these according to the themes. What do we find out? Well, commodities turned out to be number one in terms of overall. Oh, I meant to say too, it's not all just provisioning services. We've got provisioning services, couple cultural services, a regulating service, a supporting service, all in the top 5. People are thinking about all of the different things that they produce they affect when they make management decisions. So destiny control was also very high up there. So was leaving a legacy, and it turned out, so the themes really were played out in what, that we got in the interviews were really played out in the surveys. But then we also found there was a number of things that maintaining a lifestyle, providing public goods that don't necessarily benefit us at all. Things like pollinators or wildlife habitat that's not for us to be able to hunt, open space. And finally, income diversification, which was down at the bottom. And if you're an extension person, that may make you a little worried, because we're trying to get people to do that. All right. So I could conclude from this that ranchers do think about this. Well, how does this work in practice? So in this case, I'm going to fall on someone else's research. This is work by Susan Charnley, who was a speaker, I think, last year. And Hannah Gosnell at Oregon State and a couple other people. These are the Blue Mountains of northeastern Oregon. They're not very blue right now, but trust me. And so they were, in the Blue Mountains, there was a project as part of the Mountains Social Ecological Observatory Network, it was a National Science Foundation funded project in which basically they organized a process to try and see whether they could do these kinds of social ecological systems management. So there was many different formal meetings and informal meetings with Forest Service, with various stakeholders. Their focus was on trying to find a sustainable balance between livestock grazing and various cold water fisheries. And they were looking for solutions that went beyond the Forest Service grazing regulations, fishery regulations from the National Marine Fisheries Service or the Fish and Wildlife Service, NEPA. They wanted to figure out how we could, not have those things controlling people's lives. And so what happened? Well, they eventually came up with a number of different proposed innovations that were come up through this collaborative process. Redraw the allotment boundaries where needed to make more ecological sense. Now what this does is it allows rotations to be based on resource availability both in space and in time. It's more flexible. But it has some drawbacks. Some permittees may benefit, others might not. And it will require a new NEPA analysis, which is inevitably going to be appealed by some groups. And that's just part of the process, something you have to go through, because those folks are going to want to seek their favorite, the BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So that was one solution. Another was to ask permittees on adjacent allotments to share sometimes where ecologically or economically appropriate. So this is thought to improve utilization and distribution. It's very similar to the Three Creeks allotment process that many of you are familiar with here in Utah. It still requires ongoing cooperation among permittees, and the way it's envisioned, where you might be sharing one year and not the next, that creates all kinds of interesting new management difficulties, but it can use the land more effectively. What else could you do? You could adopt shorter duration, higher intensity grazing. This is also thought to provide more flexibility, but it can cost you more, and not every, the research is not necessarily showing that it will actually benefit. You can encourage increased use of range riders to keep grazers out of, keep livestock out of riparian areas without having to spend millions of dollars on fences. You could incentivize responsible grazing practices rather than punishing grazing practices that are causing problems. You can increase some flexibility in on-off dates, allow more movement between pastures. All of this is going to require a high level of trust. So what would it take to do this? It requires stakeholder and agency commitment to ongoing participation. 20 years ago now, I was part of a collaborative process to try and address winter recreation use on the Logan Ranger District. And we worked for 2 years to come up with what we thought was a workable solution. And in the meantime, they had 4 district rangers. And the 4th district ranger looked at what we'd been doing and he said, I had nothing to do with this. I don't understand this. I'm not going to do this. So the thing went on a shelf. 10 years later, they tried to come up with a forest plan revision. It ended up being, the winter recreation plan in this area ended up being litigated. You know, some guarantee that top-down regulation won't be used to squelch ideas later. And Congress has tried to do this sometimes with adaptive management areas of various sorts. It helps if there are places where you can try this stuff out. In this case, they had the Starkey Experimental Forest outside of La Grande, Oregon, and so they were able to think about testing some of these things there before applying them to other landscapes. It requires willingness to do programmatic environmental assessment versus project scale. You have, instead of reacting, we need to be more proactive. We need to think about, let's figure out what we want to do, and then if it doesn't work, what are we going to do otherwise? This is agency policy may have to be altered a bit to make that work, and of course it is going to have to pass tests in court as well. We need engagement of all stakeholders, not just in the research process, but in the monitoring process. We need financing from a broad spectrum of public and private sources. We can't expect the government to pay for all of this, but there's organizations, there's nonprofits that have a stake in these lands being better off. Maybe they'd be willing to participate. So, where do I end up? I believe that our multiple use and sustainable flows of ecosystem service is possible. Yeah. It has to be. That's all there is to it. And today, as you hear the talks from other people, we're going to hear about different efforts to try and do this. We're going to hear about some of the roadblocks that they've experienced, but we're also going to hear about some of the cool things that are happening that make us believe that it not only has to be possible, but it is possible. So thank you very much.
All right, now we have about 5 minutes for questions. So any questions you have for Dr. Brunson can be answered now.
He talked fast, he was funny, and I didn't really get any of it.
Yes.
Hello, Mark.
Hi.
One thing you talked about was trying new ideas on a research or trial basis first.
Mm-hmm.
There's a strategy that works. Can you think of an example of where that's been effective, where something's been tried on a smaller scale and then had a huge outgrowth and adoption?
Good question, Shane. The question was, are there examples of how people have gotten together, tried, in a collaborative process and tried, suggested something, they tried it on a smaller scale, it worked, and then we let it go on a larger scale. In some ways, I think even the kinds of management practices we use, think about things like the rangeland health indicators that we use. Those are things that started with managers and scientists getting together and saying, what we've been doing isn't quite working. Can we come up with another way to think about doing this? And then, they were tested on a small scale, and now they're implemented, across multiple agencies. That's a little different because it's a tool rather than a management kind of solution. There have been adaptive management areas, different efforts. I was part of one, 1991, where we tried to do some things on the Andrews Experimental Forest to try and figure out whether we could come up with an ecosystem management approach that would work there. And then that later was used throughout, the Willamette National Forest and on beyond there. What I can't tell you is what was the fate, because I moved here, I can't tell you what was the fate of trying that over several years. But there have been efforts to try and work that in the past. Does that help? See, I saw another hand somewhere further back. Maybe it was the same question. Oh, yeah.
So you talked about this idea of managing for ecosystem services as a more reasonable goal. I wonder if you could say more about what are the broad policy and regulatory changes that would need to be made in order for that to actually be possible?
Well, when you ask me about policy and regulatory changes, that I'd be better qualified to answer that if I were a person in the federal government who really truly understood how complex the policies are. But one of the things that strikes me is that all right, so let's take post-fire management policy as an example. We have this situation where, fire is declared 100% contained, and you've got, like a week to figure out what you're going to do next, and you've got to get your order in for seed almost immediately, or else you're probably not going to get it because there's more fires than there is seed available. And so we've set up a system that's designed to get seed back on the ground, but that seed doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what kind of ecosystem services we want to provide. So we end up with seed mixes, for example, that might not be appropriate for that landscape, or there are seed mixes that have species that aren't going to stay on the land very long, like alfalfa, because it's cheap. And so I think that there's probably going to need to be changes like those, where again we have to remove the rigidity and give people opportunities. I strongly believe that if the climate projections suggest that the likelihood of getting plants established the following spring, say we're going to have a spring that's unlikely to be able to support these, maybe we could wait a year. Right now we can't do that. But that would allow us to provide for more different kinds of suite of ecosystem services than we're providing now. All right, I am supposed to shut up, so.